I believe, according to this, Shaylee and Cassie are co-hosting dinner and talk, and then we're going to be transitioning right into the keynote this evening. And hold on a few seconds.
Yeah, we have not very long at this point. We have, 7 minutes to take a break before our keynote time. So you can put on your earphone or whatever you need to do, eat sooner, eat later, but we don't have a big long dinner discussion this time. And let me tell you about Teju. Her session is called The Culture of Nature and Unearthing Truths. And let me read to you her bio. Teju's work is intersectional and transnational, centering on connecting the dots between issues. Her focus is on environmental and cultural equity, climate justice, and inclusive urbanism. She uses geography's perspective, encouraging us to think about space, place, and identity. I checked out her website a lot, and I'm very excited about having her here. She has a brilliant communicator that encourages thought more than telling us what to think. And she came on our radar from Dear Tiffany. So I'm excited about that. And we have some time just to feedback and talk and share what's up for dinner. If anyone has anything to share, and if you had anything else to say, David. Thanks.
Yeah, everyone's welcome. And also, if someone wanted to play a song instead of sharing something, that's welcome, or a poem at this time. I'm going to see if Teju is online so I can just ask her what she might need. And Shaylee, do you know when she's going to be logging in?
Soon. We've been emailing each other, but I can check in with her too on that.
That's awesome.
Shortly, I don't see her in this.
And do we, she didn't send any slides or anything for us to.
No, we do need to make her a co-host so she can share her screen.
Sounds perfect. We'll do that as soon as she gets online.
Yep.
Cool. And also, if someone has a music request, I can actually throw that up on the screen. There was a few really neat songs that I pulled up. Anyone want to discuss anything, or anyone want me to play a song? There's a song by Muse that I found that it was really neat. If someone wants to play that. What do you think, Shaylee?
I'll just give a quick reminisce about the special time at for dinners and meal times at all the convergences of years past. It's always such a wonderful time that get to meet random people and really share and even contribute some to making the meals and whatnot.
Yeah. What was your favorite time, Paul or Blair? What was one of your favorite meal times? You want to tell us about that?
Oh, just I love the work part of it, when you have to put in a couple shifts throughout the weekend, you figure out, once a day or whatnot, and you get the different, who's your crew, and you get, you're cutting tomatoes next to somebody and, meeting the person who's kind of organizing it as the chef and whatnot. That's, there's not one specific time. It's every time is great.
Yeah. That's how I met Shaylee.
Yeah. On that note, during lunch and dinner, or during lunch tomorrow, we have space just to share our processing. I did a sauerkraut demo yesterday during lunch, and we welcome that opportunity to, try to recreate that as much as we can in this space. So if you're not tuning into the lunch and breakfast times, we have that kind of, room to share.
I have to say, I really miss the meals too, because having to make my own food is always a pain. So I miss all the good cooking of everyone else and being able to share produce with everyone and share my eggs with everyone and see what people bring. So, and how they use the produce, that's always amazing to me. So, yeah.
One thing that surprised me about the Pacific Northwest Convergence was I showed up for the first time, and there's this little table off to the side. And I don't know how you guys organize this, but I called it the bragging table. And there was just like all these little plates of random things people had, and they had little labels on them. And I got to taste things that I had never tasted before, and things that people worked hard to grow. And just the fact that we brought our own produce and cooked our own food actually, believe it or not, rare in convergences to the magnitude that the Pacific Northwest does. On that note, anybody have anything that this year that they grew, that if we had the convergence today, what would you be bringing to the kitchen? Anybody?
I would bring eggs.
Bring eggs. What do you have abundance of? Duck eggs. Oh, I miss duck eggs.
That's too easy for Cass. All day. What would I bring? Sauerkraut with caraway in it. I don't know. Squash. We always get a lot.
Like Samantha said potatoes, and Marcy said mole sauce. Right? Sounds great.
I would bring chard and sauerkraut. And I can't stop thinking about draft ponies.
Bring
me too.
Like delicatas, tree fruit, Hubbard's, and a big bouquet of herbs. And some flowers. And some flowers. We need flowers.
Yeah. I agree. Flowers.
Yeah, maybe we should. I don't know if we should. Oh, and Teju is here. So
awesome.
We can.
I'll get her facilitated.
Wonderful. Hello. Yeah, I'm hoping that maybe things will be safe for closer connection perhaps in the spring, and we can really organize like a kind of mellow camp out at Sahale or somewhere. And thank you, Teju, for being here. We were talking about how one of our favorite parts of these convergences is we cook together. Everybody brings food from their local community, and we just have a kitchen and we make all the meals and share them together. It's been a great part of our culture that we're missing out on this year. And go ahead. Oh, just a few things. We're going to be, our team will be keeping an eye on the chat too, to let you know, and you can let us know if you want questions throughout or at the end. And you should have screen share options set up now.
Actually, you, Shaylee, you're going to have to make that happen.
I do that.
Because you're the host for the first time.
I didn't realize I had the host hat on.
Did you stop the video yet? Sorry.
There you go.
And yeah, we're your support.
Yeah,
videos.
Yeah,
we're your support team. And we'll just kind of leave you in the facilitator position unless you want us to do anything. And there you go.
No, that's great. Hi, everyone. I am happy to be here with you all tonight. Enjoying your weekend-long experience that you've been on, so I'm sort of just hopping into the space. So I would love to start off with a poem just to ground myself and ground everyone in the space, if that's okay with you. When the giant wave comes washing over our bodies, Black people will become mermaids and Indigenous people will become seeds. What will you become? I mean, where do you come from? Immigrants, where do I come from? My parents. Our first geography is our mother. Her uterus is our first environment, our first connection to nature. We are ripped, displaced, dispossessed, torn from the land, then worked, exploited, disposed of, and thrown back to the land. When they pull the last diamond from the earth's volcanic remains, when they poison all of the water trying to pull oil from the sea floor. Where will you be? What side of history will you be sitting on, and will you be sitting there with me? See, there's no separate survival. Everyone is a full-length mirror, so please don't destroy yourselves. Don't destroy yourselves. We all come from the soil, from the earth. We are all made of the ocean from birth. We have essence, and there are ecosystems, tiny acts of resistance. Protecting the earth is protecting ourselves. My name is Teju. I am a writer, geographer, and poet based here in Oakland, California, which is Ohlone Chochenyo land, unceded Ohlone land. And I hope over the next hour and a half, I can share some of my stories, some of my ideas, some of my thoughts, and we can sort of have a conversation about why I'm joining you here, why I was asked to be here, and what I wanted to share with you all. So throughout our time together, I'm going to ask for some engagement and some conversation. So I hope those of you who feel comfortable will join me in that experience. And there will be opportunities to listen as well as opportunities to speak. So I'm going to share my screen and sort of start talking and going through the motions of presenting, and then we'll have some time for reflection and conversation throughout, but also at the end. Is that okay with everyone? Yes? Great. So what I want to talk about today is the culture of nature and unearthing truths. And over the course of the next hour and a half, we'll have more conversations about what I mean by the culture of nature and what that means specifically to me, and what I mean in the context of our conversation here tonight. So I like to always start with positionality. What I mean by positionality is helping people to understand the different levels of privilege and marginalization that my identity exists within, to help ground us in the space and help understand some of the perspective that I'm coming from. So the two places that I spent growing up in my life are West Oakland and Spanish Town, Jamaica. So at the time of growing up in West Oakland, it was the third most dangerous neighborhood in the country. Of course, at that moment, I didn't know it until I saw it on the news at age 12. And West Oakland is situated between 3 major highways and adjacent to the Port of Oakland. So at that time, kids in my neighborhood were 8 times more likely to have asthma than kids in any other neighborhood in West Oakland. So my brother and I grew up with asthma, but the difference was that our parents both worked at colleges and universities, so we had access to healthcare. When we were having asthma attacks, we can go to the emergency room. We grew food in our garden. We had a garden. And also at that time in West Oakland, there were no grocery stores in the neighborhood. So my parents went to farmers markets and drove to the other side of town to get organic food, to get fresh food. So I grew up in a situation very different from the other kids who were growing up sort of near me. Our house was this sort of green bubble. People would come over and they would see plants, and we were growing food, and it was just like a different world. And so I was very aware that although in many ways I looked like and acted like the kids in my neighborhood, I had a different experience from them. In addition to that, I also spent time in Spanish Town, Jamaica. My mother is from Kingston, Jamaica, and so it was important to her that we spent time on the island understanding what our roots were and what the history was of Marunaj and the people who escaped slavery, and then the Jamaican nation state as it grew after colonialism. And Jamaica has been experiencing climate change very rapidly. One of the beaches that I used to go to growing up is no longer there because of sea level rise. And also the Jamaican government let a Chinese company dig out the rest of the sand to build a highway from Kingston to Ocho Rios, which is a tourist location. So my relationship to the environment is very much about environmental justice and the injustice I saw growing up in West Oakland, and climate justice, the reality of climate change in places that are south of the equator. And in the US, we talk about climate change in terms of policies and in terms of some future reckoning, but that reckoning is very much alive and happening right now for people in many parts of the world that are not the West. And even in the West, we're starting to see changes that are affecting natural disasters and our crops. So my position is as someone who has had higher education, as someone who was middle class. Even though my family never had a lot of money, both my parents had higher education, so we had access to resources and funding. And so when I grew up with asthma and in this sort of polluted place of West Oakland, I knew that this was by design. And so I was able to, throughout my life, think of ways to mitigate some of the injustices that I saw in ways that other people who I grew up with could not do. And also as someone who's still living in Oakland, a city that is undergoing rapid gentrification, I recognize the privilege of being able to stay here when many of the working class people that I grew up with have been displaced to places like Antioch and Stockton, which are suburbs 30 to 45 minutes away from Oakland. So in all of that, all of my identities, there are marginalized identities, there are privileged identities, and I like to use positionality as a way to situate myself in the work that I do. And I think it's really important to do so as we're thinking about how we can change the world through our connection with the earth. And so positionality, as I said, is central to my work. And it's one of the reasons why I believe that environmental equity should result in cultural equity. So when I was growing up, I recognized that because the environment that I was growing up in and some of the kids I grew up in was not healthy, was not connected to safe green spaces, was not connected to nature, there was no way to grow your own food for the most part. But if you change the environment, if you change people's access and relationship to nature, then you can also increase the justice related to cultures that are excluded and marginalized from nature, excluded and marginalized from growing their own food, excluded and marginalized from having access to healthy, organic things to eat. And so I always start with positionality as a reflection of why I'm able to be here with you all today, and as an affirmation of why I continue to do the work that I do. So I want to talk a little bit about my experiences in Jamaica, and particularly the economy of my grandmother's yard. My grandmother had chickens, there were dogs, there were cows across the street. So it was this sort of small ecosystem in her yard. And I remember one time when we were in trouble, she created this very unique punishment. And I'll never forget, we had to pick up the mangoes that fell from the tree in the yard and take them across the street to feed to the cows. And so there was lots of mangoes. And what happens in Jamaica is that when mangoes start to ripen, they all sort of ripen at the same time. So it's sometimes virtually impossible to eat all the mangoes. You collect them, you put them in your fridge, you give them away, you dry them, you do everything you can with the mangoes, but there's still so many. And there's about 150 species of mango in Jamaica. And so my grandma didn't believe in letting these mangoes go to waste. So the chickens would pick at some of them, and we'd have to take the rest, which are all mushy and they'd been laying in the sun, and we took them across the street to the cows, and the cows are eating them. And I don't know if you've seen cows eat, but the mangoes are dripping down their mouth. And then eventually they pass the mangoes, which makes manure, which we use to compost in the yard. And so I grew up with my grandmother always using everything that was in the yard and always using everything that was in the space around her, and nothing went to waste. And so I don't ever remember the dogs having dog food. I remember that we would take some of the leftovers, rice and beans and oxtail bones, and we'd put them in a bowl and we'd put them in the yard, and the dogs would come and eat them. And so every part of the animal was used, and there was never any waste. And so my grandmother really understood this sort of circular reality that she created in her garden, and she recognized that she had a privilege to create this circular reality for her grandkids and her children. And long before I was born, she understood the impact of having control over your environment. So when she was working as a secretary, when she looked like this on a sugar estate, the cane cutters didn't have access to the grounds when they weren't working, and many of them didn't have bank accounts. So my grandmother helped the cane cutters pool their money to create a credit union, and lobbied the family that ran the estate to give them access to the grounds when they weren't working, when they weren't cutting cane. And she recognized that these cane cutters having a pool of money from which to use for their own resources, to use for their own livelihoods, and having access to this beautiful estate grounds, not only as a form of labor, but actually as a form of luxury, was crucial to decolonization and crucial to having the privileges that she had. So what my grandmother always taught me is that the systems thinking that we learn from being close to nature and working with the earth should help us understand the systems of inequality that exclude certain people from having access to nature and the land. And so she embedded this into me from a young age, as did my parents. And so as I think about my life and the way that I'm able to live right now, I'm constantly thinking about my grandmother and the little ecosystem she created, not only in our garden, but for the people that she worked with long before I was born, long before I was a thought. And so the other day, I was washing some kale. We grow a lot of kale. I eat kale maybe twice a day. So most of our garden is kale, different forms of kale. And so the other day I was washing kale in the sink. And after I'd washed the kale, I noticed a little caterpillar in the sink. And I was like, oh, this is so fun. I rarely see bugs in my food, primarily because most of my food comes from the grocery store, and most of that food, when I can't buy it organic or locally produced, is flown over from miles away, so bugs don't have a chance to live. There's no life in the food after it travels to you, after it's been, after the pesticides and the travel and being in stores. And so I was so pleased to see this caterpillar. And so I took the caterpillar and put it right back on the kale outside, because it seems to enjoy the kale. And I realized in that moment that not only did I have time to walk 2 steps outside of my house to pick kale, fresh food that we grow without any pesticides, but also that I had the time to take that caterpillar and place it back in that garden and not kill it. I had the time to eat and experience my food without having to participate in violence. And so I was thinking in that moment, I want all Black people to be able to feed themselves and their families without having to participate in or experience violence. And so in that moment, just a few days ago, I was reminded of the privilege that I have to grow food, to not inflict violence on other living beings when I'm eating from my garden, something that is locally sourced, if you will, grown organically, if you will, just outside of my doorstep. And so to have a rapport with nature, I recognize as a privilege, having grown up in West Oakland in this very urbanized environment and having experienced Spanish Town, Jamaica, I realize that I have a healthy, positive relationship with nature, and that this is not something that many Black people have, and this is not something that many people have in general. And so I recognize it as a privilege. And so over time, I've gotten to develop a relationship with nature, and this is something that I want more people to have access to. I want people to have more access to develop a positive relationship with nature, and in that process heal. And so when I'm thinking about eating and not inflicting violence, I'm reminded of Kim TallBear, who is an Indigenous scholar, and she says, no one eats without killing. A lot of modern day conversations around trying to lessen the carbon emissions of food is very heavily around meat consumption. And what Kim TallBear wants people to know is that every living thing that we interact with, plants, animals, the environment, is alive. And so even if we're picking kale from our garden, even if we're picking a fruit from a tree, that is a sort of killing. However, the killing that happens in nature is towards continuity. It's for energy so that you can continue and procreate. Whereas the violence that happens in society is for profit and against nature. So while as Kim TallBear is talking about this necessity of killing for continuity, of us consuming plants, which then become energy, which allows to procreate, of bears eating fish, which becomes energy to feed them and their cubs, of salmon spawning and then dying because they've done what they need to do. It's about continuity. It's not about profit. It's not about violence. And so this idea of being with nature doesn't mean that there's not killing, but it means there's not violence. And so this idea of controlling nature for profit is a form of violence that colonialism really perpetuated in this country that we call the United States. And so we've been talking a lot about the Anthropocene, those of us who are caring about changing the experience that we're in right now. And the Anthropocene is defined as relating to or denoting the current geological age, viewed as the period during which human activity has been the dominant influence on climate change and the environment. However, my perspective is that the Anthropocene was not created equally. I think a better definition of the Anthropocene is relating to or denoting the current geological age, viewed as the period during which settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and imperialism has been the dominant influence on climate change and the environment. indigenous humans had relationships to the earth and to their ecologies that were not based on domination and were not based on power. With the onset of settler colonialism and the development of racial capitalism from colonialism and settler colonialism, and the imperialist projects that go across the world trying to control and extract resources, that has what brought us to this current age where the climate is changing so fast that we can't keep up with it, where human continuity is at risk. And so I think it's important as we're having these conversations about our relationship to the earth and about humans' relationship to the earth that we have nuance and that we recognize that this is not a conversation about humanity. This is actually a conversation about indigeneity and the way that it was disrupted and interrupted by colonialism. And so indigenous humans got what they needed from the environment, but they didn't inflict violence and control over the land or other living things the way that colonialism did. So it's not to say that indigenous humans did not change their environment or shape their environment to get food, to have a place to live, to have their experience and have their societies. But it wasn't about violence against the earth or control over the earth or control over the land. It was about how to be a part of an ecological system, how to get what you need, but also give it back so that others can get what they need. And so colonialism created this sort of normalization of the degradation of the earth, and congruently was also about the violence against Black humans who were working the earth and other species. It was about exploiting the natural limits of the earth. So how much can we produce? Can we mass produce to increase profit? And so this sort of degradation of the earth, along with the degradation of Black bodies and other species, necessitated philosophies and theories that developed in the late 19th century of care of earth, care of people, and working within nature's limits. And so I understand permaculture to be a return to agricultural and cultural practices that value life and ecological systems. So really as returning to indigenous ways of living alongside nature. So while this field developed in the 1970s and 80s, I feel like it came from a reckoning of understanding the ways that colonialism has created stress on our planet and on the people on the planet, and needing to return to ways that give life, not only to the land, but to those of us who are living in community with each other. And so indigenous communities in the Americas, tropical Africa, and South Asia understood themselves as part of their ecological region. And there were cultural practices, agricultural practices, that were about being part of an ecological region rather than disrupting or controlling an ecological region. And so one of the practices that started in ancient West Africa, which is still used today, is planting seeds with your foot. And so what you do is you make an indentation in the soil with your heel, and then you drop the seed into that indentation and cover it over with your foot. The reason why this practice started was to minimize how disturbed the soil gets. So rather than a whole bunch of tillage and turning of the soil, which over time creates erosion, planting a seed with your foot with an indentation of your heel and then covering it over minimizes that disruption of soil and allows the soil aggregates to regenerate without being so interrupted by humans and our need to feed ourselves by planting food. Similarly, indigenous communities across North America used ritual burning to not only help new trees grow in the forest, but to decrease the trees that were in the line of fire when natural wildfires existed. And so as we're struggling with fires in Northern California, but across California more generally, a lot of people are thinking about the indigenous agricultural practices of spiritual burning and cultural burning that actually had ways of controlling not only natural wildfires, but wildfires that erupt from the lifestyles that we live in. And so this is a person from the North Mono tribe showing the types of ritual burning that might happen near the forest and on land that has previously been agricultural land to plant food. So indigenous relationships to the earth had to do with ensuring that there was enough for everyone to have throughout generations. It was really about taking what you need and then moving on so that those who come after us can also take what they need and move on. And so resilient communities meant regenerating ecologies, taking and putting back, and also not taking the first things you see and not taking more than you need. Okay, so I just want to take a breath to breathe a little bit and think about some of the things that we're feeling in these first few minutes. And if you feel comfortable, I would love for you to close your eyes. Take a few breaths. And think about how your body's feeling. If you are careening forward to look at the screen, maybe sit up. If your shoulders are to your ears, maybe relax your shoulders. Feel your feet, feel your seat, and just think about how you're feeling. And I want you to hold in your mind, what does expanded awareness feel like? So when you're learning something new, when you're experiencing information that is maybe not at the forefront of your mind, even if it's in your subconscious, what does it feel like to expand and experience that information in your body? And so now that we have these gatherings on Zoom, the sort of embodied experience of being with others and relating to the world is sort of digital. And it's through these screens that are kind of small and we're sort of hunched over them. And so I'd love to just take a moment if people could share right now what they're feeling in their bodies, what the first few minutes of this conversation has felt like to them, thoughts that are coming up with what I just shared before we start on the presentation again. So feel free. There's no necessary order. But if anyone feels compelled to share how they're feeling in their body or other things they're experiencing at this moment, I would love for you to share.
Gratitude for this incredible board.
Yeah. I have a lot of gratitude for us all coming together here. And I really appreciate your reframing of, I'm not going to pronounce the word that word that I need to see in front of me to say. Yes, thank you. That was a really eloquently put, and it makes sort of the history of humanity so much clearer. So thank you.
I'm feeling very open and like raw, and really, really appreciate you sharing your story. And I just feel like I had this wave wash over me from everything you shared, and yeah, thank you.
A lot of hope that you know, based on what you've described, putting it, putting something into words and bring it into our current, forefront of our mind, and then and where we're all now kind of looking at things in a clear way on the topic, which is a very weighty, very difficult topic to address. And it makes me hopeful that, it just fills me with hope, and still sort of running that against previous learnings, right? And grappling with, does that fit my previous descriptions of the history that brings us up to that framing of, I guess, the settler colonialism, racial capitalism and imperialism, those terms, really sort of thinking through that in the past, hundreds of years to thousands of years, and how that aligns.
Yeah, and I really see you as a sacred earth goddess and a sister poet, and just a radiating, radiant person. And I'm just so appreciating your words and your knowledge. And I am so with you about how we all have to get back to nature.
Wonderful. So there will be more opportunities for us to be in conversation. I'm going to continue on with some other things I want to share with you all. this evening. So what does expanded awareness feel like? So I wanted to talk about the theme of cultivating community. And upon hearing the theme, which I think is so important, my thoughts were, who is the community and what are we actually cultivating? And so my first thought was, well, we are the community, right? And often when we're saying the community, we're talking about people outside of us. And so I was thinking about what happens if all of us understood the community to automatically include us and others, even if we don't feel an affinity with others. What if we expanded this idea of the communities not being separate communities, but all of us being part of imagined communities on this earth together? And so the community is not something that is outside of us, but like nature, it is not separate from us. It's something that we're all a part of. And how we view ourselves as being related to community is really important as well. And so when we're thinking about community and cultivating community, I think the questions that we should be asking are, who is not included in the community and who is the community not accessible to? Oftentimes, when we work really hard to create an inclusive community, we're always confused about why there are certain people who don't feel included. And what it's hard for us to understand is that there's certain ways that a community is not accessible, even if we think it's inclusive, because most of us come from our own background and our own perspective. So what may be accessible to our bodies, what may be accessible to our identity, what may be accessible to our experience is not necessarily accessible to the bodies, experiences, and identities of people who are not included. So we are the community. The community is not outside of us, but how do we continually make the community more accessible? How do we continually think of who is not included, why they're not included, and what we can do to bring them in? And so on the question of what are we cultivating? Well, in my opinion, it's a completely different world. Now I think we're cultivating this different world, starting with a regenerative and sustainable bioregion. And I believe that starting with bioregions, starting with locally, geographically specifically networked communities that are connected to the earth that is near to them will create a ripple effect, which will eventually create a different world. So while cultivating a different world seems like a big task, and it is, I do believe that working in bioregions gives us a foundation from which to create these ripples of having different relationships to the earth and thus different relationships to each other. And so I think what's really important when we're thinking about cultivating a different world is moving away from judgmentalism, moving away from moralistic behavior towards nuance and plurality. So often when we feel like we're cultivating the world the way it needs to be, we know what solutions we need to use to make nature more regenerative. We sometimes get into the space of moralistic behavior and looking at others as not knowing the way to cultivate a different world, or not seeing other people's approaches as solutions to a different world. But what we know from nature is that biodiversity and pluralities actually works in tandem along with each other towards continuity. There's not one way that nature reproduces itself. There's many ways that different species, different plants, different sentient beings reproduce themselves. So I think it's important when we're thinking about cultivating a different world to mimic the biodiversity necessary for the continuity of nature and the continuity of humanity, and try to work towards this sort of nuance. And rather than thinking about there being one path towards cultivating a different world, thinking about there being many paths towards cultivating a different world, and that these paths are relevant to people based on where they are, where they've come from, how they identify, their relationships to nature, their need to heal with nature alongside nature. And so there's no one way of cultivating. And I think it's really important as we think about cultivating community to think about cultivating plurality and expanding the community in that process, so that that as we're thinking and learning new ways in a multitude of ways, we also are bringing people in who challenge us on our perspective, challenge us on our experiences, and show us different ways of being and relating. And so my process of cultivating community is really thinking about certain phrases that I'm going to put on the screen. And I would love to hear people's different reactions to these phrases, what they mean to you. I'm going to try to be able to see some of you. So I am going to put some phrases up on the screen. And if something comes to mind, whatever thoughts come to mind, I would love for you to just share popcorn style what comes to mind with the phrase. So the first phrase is culturally relevant. What does that mean to you? What comes up for you? I would just love to hear people's thoughts popcorning. When I say culturally relevant, what does it mean when we're talking about cultivating community in a way that's culturally relevant?
First thing that comes to my mind is not speaking because I'm afraid I'm not culturally relevant in what I'm about to say.
Mm-hmm. So maybe being silent and not feeling like you're relatable, not feeling like you're relevant. So holding your voice. What else comes to mind for people?
In the chat, we have things people can use.
Okay.
What is culture?
Mm-hmm.
Memes.
Mm-hmm.
And within the context of one owns culture.
Mm-hmm. Other things that come to mind?
Respecting what has already been, what has come before, where people are coming from.
Mm-hmm.
I think of it of how it relates to sauerkraut and bread, and it's the certain other organisms that thrive in harmony with what else is going on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Being part of a system. So I think of culturally relevant as what you do and how you do it making sense and being well received by the local community that exists there. The references that are being used, even if they're based on your experience, there's this intention to relate them to other people's experience, to understand the different contexts of what's around you and what may be aligned with the needs and the desires of the people in the space, or the beings or the living organisms in the space that you're trying to be a part of and work alongside. What about when I say community desired and community designed? What comes to mind when I say community desired and community designed?
I think instead of it like the opposite of people going off and being like, I'm going to do my own thing. I don't know. I don't trust anybody else. I'm just going to do this. But like something organically coming from the surface and arising as a co-creation between people as part of a system with everybody's needs and desires in mind.
Yeah, I was gonna say really honoring everyone's needs within a community, and that's both like pretty basic physical needs, but then all the emotional and spiritual needs, just having that in mind and heart.
Mm-hmm. Functional.
What was that? I didn't hear that one.
Functional.
Functional. Mm-hmm. What else comes to mind? It doesn't have to be sentences or phrases. It could be words. It could be
harmony.
Harmony. Mm-hmm.
And symbiosis.
Mm-hmm.
In the chat, we have the actual stakeholders, the people who should be centered, not necessarily the ones who pay or ask for a project.
Mm-hmm.
There's also togetherness for desired and separated by design.
Mm-hmm.
Humility.
Humility. Mm-hmm.
Many leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Filling the needs of local people and involving the local native people in influencing it. Mm-hmm. And building a future together, intentionally honoring all the needs. And I think of it as the term of organizational justice, when the people who are a part of the system are designing it and have a say in how it's made.
Absolutely. So there's this element of co-creation not coming in and deciding what is supposed to happen, but thinking of it as really being built together from the ground up, from the soil up, with the people who are in that place and who have ties to that place, who are invested in that place. And really thinking about not necessarily what you want to do, but what the people who are already there need, what they desire, what makes sense for how they live, and what can be supportive to how they live. How do we design in a way that is supportive to the way of life that people want, and not the way of life that we think people should have? So rather than thinking about, here's a solution to this problem, what are the desires that people have? What is the way that they want to function in society that is not supported? And how do we design from that space of co-creation and co-collaboration, rather than here's a problem and here's a solution? So really collapsing this binary of there's a community problem and there's a solution, to there are needs and desires of a community, and we could design around those needs and desires of a community. What comes to mind when I say geographically specific? So I always talk about geography, not only because I'm a geographer, but because I think it's absolutely crucial. But when I say geographically specific, what comes to mind for people?
Place-based.
Mm-hmm. Place-based. What else?
That every area is different. Every space is different. Not one solution will match the solution for another place.
Absolutely. What else?
Observation.
Observation. Mm-hmm. What else comes to mind for people for any of these, but geographically specific, culturally relevant, community desired and design? When we're thinking about the theme, cultivating community, what is coming to mind when I bring up these phrases?
From the chat, we have sustainability that matches the land.
Mm-hmm.
Song lines of landscape and memory,
mm-hmm.
appropriate, and meeting the needs of everyone on the land as well as the people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Think about the cultural history of the people that exist in that location, whatever location.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Go
ahead.
Oh, sorry. Something came up for me about community design and community design as in the importance of including more than human community in that community desired and community designed. Otherwise, all of our creations are human-centric and tend to go towards destructive. So we have to include the whole community, the whole ecological community in community desired and designed.
Mm-hmm.
I think of geographically specific in terms of how different life thrives in different ecologies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And certain things exist in some places and not other places. If I wasn't a geographer, I'd be a geologer, because geologists know better than geographers that when you're looking at a particular place, it's made up of all of the different environmental experiences that have happened before that place. So whenever you're looking at the geography of an area, you're also looking at its past histories. And sometimes you could learn this history through the soil. You could learn this history from what's not there and what was there, places where there were forests, there are no longer forests. What is the cover happening on the ground? What does the sky look like? How have the natural disasters that existed there changed over time? So being geographically specific is recognizing that a geography is not one period of time, but that it's a multitude of periods of time. And you have to be in relationship with the communities of people and other sentient beings that are in that place, recognizing that in another place that may not be relevant at all. And so I have this picture of a school of fish, because in the Caribbean, a lot of our conversations around the climate changing are not really about humans' experience of it, it's about the sea creatures' experience of it. And so people have started talking about sea life as communities of fish or communities of turtles, to change and reframe the way we understand other living beings. And so there's whole projects that are just about like creating safe communities for sea life. And that is very culturally relevant in the space of an island in the Caribbean Sea. But what it also shows is that when you think about what a community may want, a community that you maybe don't identify as being a part of, you have to step outside of yourself and think about what might be useful for them. And if they can talk, can I listen to them? And so there's a lot of marine biologists who are now trying to figure out if you could listen to the sea, if you could listen to the ocean, if you could listen to sea creatures talking the sea, if certain things disturb them. And we know that cruise ships disturb them. We know that testing weapons underwater disturbs them. And so by listening to the water and observing, there starts to become a geography of these communities of sea creatures who don't talk in the way that we talk, but who we can be attentive to and who we can design around so that those of us on the surface can also listen to each other and design around our needs as being in relationship with this island ecosystem. And so when we're thinking about being culturally relevant and community desired and designed and geographically specific, we're encouraged to think about all of the different ways that we experience the world as sentient beings and all the different ways that the world experiences us as well. So being aware of how we disrupt nature and what we can do to sort of resume that harmony. And so a lot of the issues in the Caribbean around sea life have to do with people wanting to be on the beaches, wanting to be in this beauty, but not knowing how to not be disruptive to it. And so there's several people in Barbados who go around collecting sea turtle shells, and they collect sea turtle shells, they close the beach, and then they put all the sea turtle shells back on the shore and close the beach until the sea turtles hatch and get back into the ocean to try to find their communities and their mothers. And they started doing this because they recognize that people love sea turtles, but they don't realize how the ways that they access the beach and wanting to always be able to access the beach is completely disrupting sea turtle communities. So in listening to other sentient beings and finding other ways to listen with our body, other ways to listen with our spirit, then we could think of changing our lifestyle to be less disruptive to the nature and also still be able to bask in its beauty. And so in my work as a geographer and a writer, I work as a consultant with several different companies and organizations. And one thing that I really center my work on is this idea of cultivating community as being about expanding community. Because often we're cultivating community with people who agree with us, with people who look like us, with people who have similar experiences to us. And it's completely by accident sometimes. Sometimes it is on purpose. And so when we think about who the community is, we need to think about what are tangible things that we can do to expand the community. And so one of the ways that I've been working on expanding community is with FiberShed. And FiberShed is an organization in Northern California that is based on local fiber, local dye, and local labor that use regenerative practices. So FiberShed develops and supports regional fiber systems that protect and regenerate the health of our biosphere. They center practices such as carbon farming and regenerative agriculture. So regenerative agriculture is really central to FiberShed's work. And as I was working with FiberShed, I wanted us to develop a definition of regenerative agriculture that got to the heart of working in a local fiber network, in a local carbon farming network. And so the definition that I came up with is that regenerative agriculture is an approach that transforms current agricultural systems by centering indigenous, geographically specific practices that enhance and preserve ecological bioregions. This results in climate change mitigation, restoration of soil and natural water systems, and thus an alternative regional social ecology and economy. So in my definition of regenerative agriculture and the way that FiberShed approaches regenerative agriculture is that it's not just maintaining and preserving and regenerating the biosphere and being part of an ecological region. It's also transforming the social relationships between people and the earth, and between people and people, and between the way we live, work and exchange with each other. So it's not only to affect the social ecology, it's also to affect the social economy and to tend to all of the different histories of the land. So regenerative agriculture allows us to Regenerative agriculture allows us to tend to the legacies of the land, to repair our relationship to the earth and to those who were displaced and degraded alongside of it. So the displaced indigenous communities, 15 million out of the 18 million indigenous communities in North America were killed by disease or by war. And to the people, the Black Africans who were forcibly brought to this land, who were degraded alongside the environment and who were forced to work in this degradation of the environment. So regenerative agriculture in this sense is a way for us to tend to all of these legacies and change our relationship to the earth and thus change our relationship to each other. And so the way that I do this primarily is by working with FiberShed's Producers Network to build awareness. And FiberShed's Producers Network is a membership-based network of farmers, ranchers, designers, sewers, weavers, knitters, felters, spinners, mill owners, and natural dyers living and working within 19 counties in North and Central regions of California. FiberShed also has some international partners like Prakti FiberShed in Tamil Nadu, India, but primarily they work in this north central region of California to build a local regional network, FiberShed, that talks about regenerative agriculture from the seed to the sow in a soil to soil cycle, so what we make can be put back into the earth. And so I work with a group of their producers to think about the ways in which those of us who have the privilege to work directly with the land can build our awareness in hopes of expanding our community and thus changing society by supporting equity and justice. So with the producers cohort, some of the conversations we've had have been about US land legacies and access. So what are the legacies of displacement of indigenous people? What are the legacies of deforestation that was necessary to create plantations? What are the legacies of turning swamps into rice fields to cultivate rice? What are the legacies of introducing non-native plant species into this earth, like into the specific part of the earth, like in California, introducing eucalyptus, which have been a real issue because they take over a lot of space, but they were brought over by Australians who needed a lot of lumber when they were working on the gold trade. So they brought over this eucalyptus, planted it here, and essentially cut it down to create lumber for the gold trade. And so what are the legacies of inviting eucalyptus into this place and displacing Indians before inviting non-native species? What does it mean when sharecroppers, after slavery was abolished, were not able to buy the land that they worked for years and that their ancestors worked? What does it mean when farmers who are Black farmers in Florida were not able to get loans from the government, were not able to get grants to repair their land after natural disasters? All of these legacies in the land on what we call the United States of America has to do with access to the land right now. And so although 90% of the people who work this land in the first half of the 17th century and the 18th century and the 19th century were Black people, about 0.5% of all land in the US that's farmland is owned by Black people. So Black farmers are almost non-existent in this space of the United States because of systemic exclusion, even though their ancestors were literally tied to the land. We talked about positionality and privilege, and what does it mean to have land, to have access to land, and to have this privilege of being able to grow your food, to have this privilege of being able to participate in climate beneficial practices, to have this privilege to think about what it means to work in a way that is regenerative, because you have to focus less on profit and so can focus more on the ecologies that you're a part of. What does it mean when you have this privilege of owning land that's passed down through generations and wanting to think about ways to expand access, which also means changing how we pass land, whether it's through generations, whether it's in the form of a a land trust? How do we change our privileges and redistribute some of our privilege that we've inherited that we may not necessarily need in generations to come? We talked about embracing complexity. And so it's me and a group of ranchers and farmers, and we're talking about all of these concepts about racial equity, about racial capitalism, about colonialism. And they're like, okay, and I know this has to do with agriculture, and it feels very complex. And so I created a space where we could really embrace this complexity and say, yes, it is complex. Agriculture is about the earth and it's about a culture. How do we include all of these conversations? How do we embrace this complexity rather than trying to obscure it? We talked about what it means to redistribute land and resources. So once we understand our positionality, once we understand the privilege of inheriting wealth, of inheriting land, what does it mean to redistribute this inherited wealth, redistribute this land, and collectively manage it, collectively run it? Does it necessarily mean that one person needs to own land? Do we need to have private land? Can we have common land? And so we talked about what it means to redistribute land and resources and completely change the structure of how people are able to get to land, how people are able to work on land. We also talked about holding space for trauma and social pathologies. So when we build our awareness and expand our community, we recognize that not everyone is going to have the same relationship to nature and the earth that we have. Some people, Black people, brown people, may have traumatic relationships with nature. They may be scared of the forest because that's a place where Black people were lynched. They may be scared of nature. They may be scared of getting dirty because there was so much devaluation of working on the earth because of years of slavery. So people who are trying to repair their relationships to nature may have trauma. And when we know our positionality, when we know our privilege, we have to learn how to hold space for that trauma, hold space for the social pathologies that may come up from these legacies of exclusion and inaccess. So when we're expanding our community, we're also expanding our capacity to hold space for trauma and to talk about and to work through and to heal from the social pathologies that have come from the way our environment has been designed and the way our society has been designed around violence to the earth and violence to Black people. So in my conversations with the producers, in my conversations with FiberShed, we talk about all of these different things just to think about how we can expand our community and better support equity and justice. So when we're talking about nature and our individual relationships to nature, when we're talking about regenerative agriculture, we're also talking about the history of this country and the geological history of the environments that we're in and the geographic history of the bioregions that we're creating. And we're also talking about trauma. And so that's why I wanted to just take that moment to pause and think about how we're feeling in our bodies. Like, how are people feeling in their bodies as I'm talking about this, as I'm talking about and sharing about my work with FiberShed? I want you to be thinking about what it means to build awareness and expand community in our bodies and what that feels like. So my approach to all of this work is very much encompassed by this quote by Lee Miracle from Raven Song: "Where do you begin telling someone their world is not the only one?" So I place myself in the center of this story to show that the world that I live in is not only the only one, but it may be vastly different from your world in many ways and incredibly similar to your world in many ways. And so this conversation about cultivating communities, also this conversation of saying, not only is there a world outside of your world, but that there are many worlds and that we need to make space for the plurality of worlds that exist because we're relating to each other from our worlds. So we begin by telling someone that their world is not the only one and that our world or my world is just as valuable as that. So we're in a pandemic and I spend a lot of time thinking about urban communities and nature and agriculture and regeneration and Black geographies. And so what I have found in this time of the pandemic is that Black people growing food in their gardens has given me hope. What I noticed over the past 6 months is that family, friends, other people I see on Instagram who identify as Black have started growing food during the pandemic. People who have never had gardens, people who have never grown food have started to grow food. And I was like, this is so amazing. I love this. This is so interesting. I want to talk about it. So I created the survey to just ask people to send around to Black people they know who started taking care of plants or growing food during the pandemic. And I wanted to know, why is this happening? And what I learned is that not only do people have more time that they're spending at home, but they're thinking about the different systems that have broken during the pandemic and wanting to figure out if they can create certain things for themselves that normally they rely on others to create. And so what was coming to light was that when our industrialized society that continually fails us develops multiple overlapping crises, so a pandemic, climate change, ongoing racism, people turn to nature and direct action for mental health and practical livelihood. So not only did people talk about not wanting to wait in line for stores, they talked about the spiritual refreshments they get from working with plants and having plants in their apartments or starting a garden in their apartment complex. So it was about this practicality of food, but also this mental health and wanting to directly impact some of the crises that are happening in the world. And so my friend Malik in the survey said, I feel a responsibility to know how to grow food and where I can. It's adventurous and fraught with connections to how Black folks have been tied to the land here. So he was really interested in like what it means to take the responsibility of knowing where your food comes from and knowing how your food is created and knowing where you can create food. He lives in an apartment and they have a yard. And he also felt like it was this adventure because he knows that his ancestors had worked on the land. And so he feels like there's this sort of tie to the land that Black people naturally have. And so while he didn't start his garden because he was Black, in his process of starting to grow food, he knew that there was something to do with Black identity and food and being tied to the land. And so he wanted to take agency in his relationship with the land in this space of a pandemic where he's thinking about health, where he's thinking about violence against Black bodies, where he's thinking about having more time at home, having more time in general. And so what we know is that at the root of all of these crises is a system that degrades the environment and people. So it's really all the same crises. And when I think about the crises that we live in as being the same crises, I'm drawn to social ecology. And social ecology is the belief that all ecological issues arise from social issues of domination and power hoarding. So because we're trying to dominate each other and the land, and those who are successfully dominating others want to hoard the power that they get from dominating themselves, others, and the land, there are these ecological issues that arise from this domination, from this power, from these hierarchies, from this colonial way of being, which is about controlling and centralizing rather than regenerating and decentralizing. And so I like to think about social ecology as a way to imagine a different world and a space from which to assess what we think of as an ecological crisis and assess what we think of as a social issue and find the thread that actually connects those. And so a social ecology's perspective encourages us to think horizontally rather than hierarchically. So focusing on integration with nature rather than domination of nature, focusing on building power in community with community rather than power and resource hoarding, focusing on regional biodiversity and sustainability rather than monoculture and imperialism, which is predicated on mass production and the devaluation of labor. So through social ecology, we're not only thinking about building power together in communities in the form of sharing resources, we're also thinking about what it means to be in community with nature and in community with the land. We're also thinking about what it means to be in community with each other. So rather than working in hierarchies, thinking about collective management of earth and of life together. And so I think of sort of Black people in gardening is bringing up all of these theoretical and philosophical issues that get to the heart of what it means to be in right relationship with the earth and what it means to be in right relationship with each other. And so for me, Black people growing gardens during the pandemic reminds us that when we have more time, we can carve out new paths that are more sustainable and holistic. So most of my friends and family were not thinking in these philosophical, theoretical ways when they decided to grow food during the pandemic. They simply had more time. And by having more time, they realized that they can think more deeply about the way that they consume and that they could live more sustainably and holistically. And so it proves to us that time is really a luxury and a privilege. And some of us who have more privileges, some of us who have more time can actively work towards sustainability, but ultimately what we want to do is give everyone more time to work towards more sustainability and to be more holistic. And so what I hope to share tonight and for us to talk about, I'm going to stop talking for a little bit, but what I want us to talk about is the fact there is no one cultural relationship to nature, that our relationship to nature is personal, it's environmental, it's societal, it's based on the nation states that we believe ourselves to be a part of. There is no one cultural relationship to nature. And there is no one way to be in community. There is a multitude of ways to be in community, to be with each other. And so as we're thinking about the plurality of cultural relationships to nature, we're also embracing the plurality of community. And so what we can embrace from nature and integrating it into our cultures is holding space to cultivate plurality, being critical of the legacies of exclusion, and expanding our ideas of accessibility. And so in these next few minutes that we have together, I'd love to answer some questions and have a conversation about people's culture of nature and about the ways that they're hoping to expand their community.
Thank you, that was awesome.
Who's gonna go first?
All of us.
You just said culture of nature, and it reminded me of something that I've actually flipped those around, and the nature of culture. And just I've always been a person who's at least had the intention to stop and observe nature, both in the agricultural realm or the human realm, and just saying, what is the nature of this culture? And so, yeah, just a thought.
I'd like to say something about community gardens and food production. I live in a small rural community. There's probably 1,000, 1,500 people at the most in the area. And there's a lot of Hispanic people who work in the woods and in fish packing factories. But there've been several well-intentioned community gardens started, and they've all failed within a year or two, because people, but yet the food banks are busy, and this has been going on for maybe 10 years or more. And so it's people, the luxury of time. People need food, but they don't have the time to garden. People have plenty of space here. I mean, most people have houses and yards, but to have the time to grow food seems to be more of the problem than getting food. And I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, in the cities in Seattle, there's community gardens been around for a long time, but because people, and they're mostly more privileged people that use those gardens, not entirely, but often. So I don't know what the answer to that is, but maybe the time has come. I don't know, but I just want to make that comment. So
yeah. Thanks, Brent. I mean, I think capitalism is the problem. That's my personal belief. But what capitalism makes possible is that people have to use all of their time towards making profit to buy food. So that means they have less time to actually make food. And so when we live in a capitalist system where the imperative is profit, then people are always going to work towards using all of their time for making money. And that's why we have tons of mass chains of grocery stores, because people actually don't have time to either grow food. They don't even really have time to buy food, which is why we have fast food restaurants. And so there's this whole society and this whole impetus towards going as fast and as long as you can, which leaves little time or energy for anything else. And so even people that I know who want to garden, sometimes when they get home, they're just too exhausted that they don't even have the energy to water the plants. And so what I saw with the pandemic is that some people who were able to get some government assistance started having more energy and more time to actually learn how to plant and grow and eat food. And so I don't think there's any one solution that I could say besides to overthrow capitalism, but I do think we have to really rethink the way that we work and how much people get paid to work, and if people need to only make money by being paid. I think having a universal basic income is really helpful to give people more time and energy. In Stockton, California, the mayor instituted a pilot program where he gave a few families $500 more a month. And there were so many more things these families did. Spent time with their kids, started gardens, learned how to play instruments. So not only did it didn't actually change their financial situation drastically. None of them became wealthy or rich, but it gave them more time and energy to do things that were mentally good for their spirit and physically good for their body. So the way we work needs to change, and capitalism, I think, is the root of the problem. And so it's hard for communities to participate in gardening if they're trying to survive in other ways.
I'd love if you could speak on grief a bit, and especially, I mean, as someone who, like, my job is connecting people to the land, and the grief that people, Black or Indigenous people of color, have, like, with a white person trying to help that connection, as I try to give people everything that I've learned from this lens. It's very complicated.
There's more Indigenous writers writing about this now, but about feeling embarrassed when people expect them to understand regenerative practices that their ancestors used, and reminding people that they were systematically excluded from learning their languages, learning these practices. So there are several people who identify as Indigenous and who don't know these ancestral techniques that people are talking about and trying to unearth. And so not only does that come with shame, it comes with a reminder that there were ways that they were forced to shed themselves of their culture in order to assimilate to a country that's violent to them. And so I think the result of that, in the wake of that colonial history, is grief, that they now in many cases have to learn these from white people who are the descendants of white colonial settlers, who were the people who disallowed them to learn about their cultural heritage. And most of the people who could speak some of these Indigenous languages have died off. Most of the people who had these relationships to land have died off. And so there's also a grief with recognizing that so much death has happened and continues to happen in this process of reclaiming your identity and your heritage. And so what my friend Malik, I think, was illuminating in his conversation about, like, Black people being tied to the land, is that he doesn't even know how to grow food, and his great grandmother had to grow her food. And so he feels this sort of heaviness of knowing that there's this relationship to the land, but that he doesn't have any real personal experience with it. And it took a pandemic for him to start thinking about that experience. And so he has a sort of heaviness and sadness that comes from being detached from the land because it wasn't economically viable. His folks left Texas and went to New York because they needed work. And so this attachment to the land that now some of us are starting to value has been completely severed and cut. And so I think it's also like the grief is about trying to reclaim the pieces that were by design taken away from you, and that we by design don't learn. When we hear about slavery, we don't hear about the women who braided seeds into their hair. And that's why we have yam and okra in the US, actually, because enslaved women braided those seeds into their hair and they planted them. And the slave masters realized that when Africans eat native food from their country, they work better. And so they started allowing them to import seeds from tropical West Africa that they could plant in the plantations that the slaves could eat, so that they would work better. But this started as a radical act of women saying, if we're going to be forcibly taken to a new land, we're going to take our seeds with us, take our heritage with us. And so, of course, some of the practices in soul food are connected to this lineage. But when we talk about agriculture and slavery, we don't hear about that. So there's also this grief with realizing how many of the stories were not told. The more that I learn about Black geographies, I'm like, how did I not know this? How am I living and embodying the experience of identifying as Black and not knowing how deeply it's related to the relationship to seeds and the earth? And so it also is this reality that the people who are giving us back what we need, and some of the people who are helping us unearth these stories are able to do that because they were not displaced, disconnected, and violently torn from the land in the same way. And so it's also a relationship between two people and two people's lineages. And that is really hard to reconcile. And so there's the experience of grief that a Black person like me may feel, your experience of grief and guilt that you may feel for experiencing my grief. And then also we still need to relate to the land. And so how do we, there's so much like stress and emotional energy in the soil. And so how do we like talk about that? And so my only suggestion, I guess, would be to let people feel whatever they feel and not expect people to relate to the earth the way that you relate to the earth. And also in cases of working with urban Black youth, what may seem like people are disinterested or they don't care or it's not important may be grief and trauma. And that just because someone displays one emotion of disinterest or frustration doesn't mean they're not also experiencing profound relationship and a spiritual awakening. And so just like letting people experience what they experience, and as much as possible, not trying to control other people's experience. And also not expecting people to respond in a certain way. We all hold trauma differently in our bodies. So I don't know if I actually answered your question or just said a whole bunch of stuff that came to mind. But
absolutely, yeah. I mean, you're a poet too, you know. So it's just it's beautiful, and yeah, that's a big theme lately. So thank you.
You know, I think you know, trying to focus on sort of these similarities that exist between people in a given bioregion, and you know, the connectivity we all have really to the watershed that we exist in, and is lost on most of our society, whatever culture heritage they come from. You know, there's this disconnection that we exist in the watershed that we live in, and we rely on that for our water, and you know, for our waste management, and for, you know, if we're, you know, what the jobs we do can oftentimes damage the watershed that we exist in, and people are getting paid to do some damage, and that's just the reality we exist with. And there are people that we can find themselves realizing that their job is not a net benefit. And this is a very big struggle. This is a very hard reality that we all grapple with at various times in life when we're trying to figure out how to exist in this society. But I think that connection of the watershed is something that I think is really important, you know, moving forward, of which watershed do we all live in, and how is that, what's the health of that watershed? You know, are there fish still in it? And if there are, there's not, can we get them back? And the people that are in that watershed need to do that work. And I think that's a really important connectivity between all groups of people within a given bioregion and location.
Mm-hmm. And I think what's really interesting about what you said is that many people in a certain bioregion are forced to work in ways that actually is worse for the water and affects the waterways in negative ways. And so what sometimes happens when environmental groups are trying to stop bad water practices, the company or the corporation or the people are like, this is our economic way of life. And so if this is what we have to do, then this is what we have to do. And so like it's with dams, for example, a lot of fishermen are like, we actually need the dams because we've changed the waterways so much that fish no longer come to where we need to be. So some corporations put fish in certain parts of the water so that they can keep dams. So like a lot of our economic life is related to treating water badly, and people have to participate in that to have a way of life. And so we also need to change the ways that people are able to work and have more ways for people to work in a way that's regenerative and sustainable, and that doesn't actually perpetuate this sort of violence against our waterways and our watersheds that we live in. I see that Marcy Belma, it says raised hand. Marcy?
Yeah, I went to the Atlanta History Center years ago, and there was a Civil War exhibit, and it talked about, you know, like 600,000 soldiers had died in the Civil War. And soon after, the KKK was formed in the South. And my take on it is that what was lost on their behalf was the right to have plantations and slaves, and that everything that came with that way of life, the privilege, the luxury. And, you know, like I've mentioned a few times, I work in the docks and I've been there for many years. And when people of color started becoming in positions of power and in income, there was this thinking like, you know, this is disrupting the natural order of the universe. That the natural order of the universe is supposed to be that this white person is supposed to be in charge and making more money and have access to privilege. And that's supposed to be the way that the world is supposed to work. So any disruption to that was like a trigger point or something like that. So I think of it like the worldview in, you know, can people see that? Are they willing to see it? And how much can we mourn together and not like hold a blame and a guilt trip, you know, so that people are afraid of having that conversation. But it's like somebody had said in the chat, like a composting of this is what it was and this is how we can make things different. You know, it's still giving the space to mourn and acknowledge the history, but it's also focusing on things like, you know, right now what's important is the water. And I don't know how to make that happen, but at least this dialogue is happening, and I think it's amazing to hold the space, and it's great. Thank you.
And Galen is raising his hand too for when we get to that. It's in the chat.
Can I go ahead and speak? I'd raised my hand also. This is Kathy.
Yeah, go ahead, Kathy.
Yeah, I wanted to let you know that my last name is Ging, G-I-N-G. And when I was a little girl in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I was discriminated against because some people thought I was Chinese. And I had a haircut that kind of looked like a little, maybe a socialist kid in China, I don't know. But anyway, you'd be amazed how many people discriminated against the things that they aren't even, you know, I wasn't even Chinese. And it kind of stayed with me all my life. So, I mean, I share that kind of feeling with you, you know. And another thing I want to say is I'm wondering whether you think the cannabis culture, because I spent a couple of years taking some of the greenflowermedia.com classes, and they started out the gate with 35 people working for them, funded by retired basketball and football players who were tired of all their colleagues taking teammates taking drugs and all that to escape their pain. So they discovered THC and CBD and the wonderful world of terpenes. So, and I wonder if you've read the book Cannabis and Spirituality by a guy named Gray from Canada, who's a really sacred, holy man, and whether you think that the uncontrollable substances, I call them, and the cannabis family will kind of bring people together in new ways. And has that worked for you in your circle, both in Jamaica and in California?
I have not read that book, Cannabis and Spirituality, but I think cannabis is among the oldest domesticated plants on the planet. It was domesticated about 12,000 years ago. And actually, while the US was under British law, when it was a British colony, before it was the US, there was a mandate that they had to grow hemp. Hemp was seen as such a valuable product that, along with cotton and other cash crops, it was mandated that hemp was also grown in the New World. And so there was also this hemp agriculture and culture in which many enslaved Black people worked on hemp farms. And in the early 20th century, a senator who had some investments in cotton and other fiber products started a huge campaign against cannabis and all hemp cannabis related products. And he started talking about cannabis as something that Black people would use and it would make them crazy and more aggressive. And it was this first campaign to criminalize cannabis use and also to illegalize all of the production of hemp products so that it wasn't a competing fiber, it wasn't a competing with the pharmaceutical companies, and that it wasn't competing with anything else that was happening. It didn't really work out for him in the 1930s, but luckily in the 1960s and 70s, the war on drugs was started, which similarly criminalized cannabis, and it was successfully made illegal with all other cannabis products in 1970. And now, as the cannabis industry is becoming legalized, Black people are systemically excluded from it. And also there are many Black people who are still in jail because of nonviolent cannabis offenses. And also, if you get caught with cannabis, even if you're not in jail, you don't have access to any federal funding, meaning no financial aid, meaning it's harder to get a loan. And so while you can be caught with cocaine and still get financial aid to go to college, if you're caught with cannabis, you cannot. So there are ways that this systematic exclusion of Black people from the cannabis industry is directly related to this lineage of them being workers on hemp farms and then being the targets of sort of criminalization of this very useful plant. And so I think cannabis is a very useful plant, not only to get you high, but also for medicine, also for teas, also for hemp fiber, and cannabis and hemp and all the strains of it are really useful. And so I think people should really think about their relationship to it and what it means when something like this becomes a profitable legal industry, when it has disproportionately negatively affected Black people.
I'd just really like to thank you for speaking on the grief piece, especially. And it really kind of made me think about like this so-called sixth mass extinction that's currently happening, and about the like language extinction that's been happening for so long, and how like the instructions for caring for the land, like in Indigenous Turtle Island languages, have always been held in the languages. And so every time we lose the language, we lose there's an entire body of knowledge and understanding of all the songs and all the stories of how to like tend for these plants and all the reciprocal agreements. And just feeling so much like the grief of that, and how like the more I learn about specifically like my Irish Gaelic ancestors, the more I find out that we've had those agreements as well, and everybody has had those agreements, and it's all written into the languages. So every time we lose this culture, it's like something can be held, passed down for thousands and thousands of years, but it can be lost in a generation. And it's really, or maybe 2 generations, depending on factors, and so much has. And I don't know, I don't know if there's a question there necessarily, but I just wanted to appreciate what you said and like put in that piece of, yeah, it just makes me really sad, and also like really motivated to like listen to elders and like really amplify elders of anyone holding traditions, that it's like we have to keep the seeds. We have to keep planting these seeds of language. Otherwise, there's so much that's lost every single time something like that is lost.
Yeah, absolutely. Language is culture. I mean, Native, Indigenous Inuits in Greenland have over 20 words for snow, because the way that the snow is tells them about how they can fish, tells them about what the day's going to be like, tells them about what the season's going to be like. And so there's so many words for snow in Indigenous Greenlandic language. And so it's true that like part of learning that language is also part of understanding your relationship to the environment. And in pre-colonial West African societies, as early as 900 AD, there was more than one word for cotton, because they used cotton seed for medicine, they cultivated cotton for fiber, they grew cotton perennially. So there was always more than one word for cotton based on its function. And so what you also see in these indigenous languages is that relationship of language to the environment, and how many different ways you can experience the environment, and what that means for how you're able to subsist. I mean, I love Ireland. I lived there for a year when I was younger. I lived in Galway. And I remember going to Connemara, and it's one of the main places where they still speak Gaelic. And what I realized was it's a whole different way of life. It's not just that there are people there who are speaking Gaelic. The region of Connemara feels very different from Galway, which is not so far from it, because there's still this way of life that is connected to farming in a way that is different in other parts of Ireland. And so even just like being in Connemara, I was like, oh, right, there's cultures around language, and as the language shifts, so does the culture. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, because especially when you learn non-colonial languages, you realize how many words we don't have. Like there's indigenous words for not just when plants grow, but how they sprout, and when the flowers grow, and when the seeds are ready. Like there's all of these like terms that our scientific terms can't even articulate. So it's really crucial to listen to our elders and try to learn and hold on to non-colonial languages and indigenous languages.
Yeah, thank you. There's so much limitation in colonial language, and just even learning the tiniest bit of Irish Gaelic, I'm just like, oh, the feeling of what this word is just like exists in that word. And of course that can exist in English and other languages, but it's not the same. Yeah, I was thinking about this word in Gaelic. I might say it wrong, but it's mahaya. And it comes from the sensation of like everything that is not physically said that you are feeling from trees, and it's used for all beings, and like kind of like clairaudience or clairvoyance. It's the word for that. And I feel it like when I say mahaya, I feel like my heart opening, and like there's this air coming in.
How would you spell it phonetically in English?
I will try to.
I know that's really difficult, but I would love to know.
Yeah, I will type it in the chat.
We'll find the word, but it's like, it's regionally different. Like we're over here like using the internet to learn like non-colonial languages, like, but like different regionally, like it was very different across different counties. But it's like mahia, like MAHEE. I don't even know, but the spelling of the word is like, it's like a middle finger to the Romans. My friend was describing, it's like, okay, we have to use your alphabet, but like we're gonna make it unreadable.
And put G's and H's in there too. Just
yeah, there's like a TH, CH, bunch of things.
And I know one of the reasons why Ireland split was because they wanted Gaelic to be an official language in schools. And there was a lot of conflict about that because they had been an English colony for so long. And so also like language as a form of decolonization, and even in places that we don't think of as being post-colonial, but Ireland is certainly post-colonial. And in fact, there were several Irish who were sent to the Caribbean as indentured servants in the 18th century who are now Caribbean, but because they were just one of the many British colonies. So even in Ireland, we could really see how like Gaelic was a point of conflict for what it meant to be Irish versus what it meant to be in the colony of Great Britain. So I think it's incredibly interesting and instructive. Are there other thoughts or comments or last questions before I turn it back over to Shaylee?
I just want to say thank you. I've really enjoyed your presentation and you've given me a lot to think about, and I want to tell everyone about you. I have friends who I know would love you, and I just want them to know how great you are. So thank you.
Thank you,
Cassie. And I really appreciate you all sort of letting me into your community. I often say I don't really belong in any group. I'm always the sort of outlier, but I like work adjacent to so many different communities. So when Tiffany reached out to me, I was like, I don't actually do permaculture. I work with people who do permaculture, so I guess that means I do, but I'm like not in the land every day. And she was like, nope, it's fine. Like, this is what it's about. This is what cultivating community means. This thinking of people who may be outside of your purview, but like we are all really trying to have the same conversations.
Well, we love Tiffany, and when Tiffany was like, can we have her come? I was like, yes. Like, it doesn't matter. I mean, if Tiffany like says that you are a wonderful person, then we know you are. So,
well, and a friend of Tiffany is definitely a friend of ours. Please, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for including us into your world, to be a part of your community.
I really want to thank you for the first, that was just beautiful, and everything, the poem all the way through the discussion was amazing, and I'm really glad that you came this weekend. But the story about the women smuggling seeds in their hair, just, oh my God, I want to go learn. I'm a storyteller, and so I want to go learn more about that story, because it's such a powerful story of women's connection to food and to land and to traditions. And that was amazing. That was beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Please do look that up. Another fun history about women and hair and holding the future is that in Colombia, in San Basilio de Palenque, which is on the coast near Cartagena, women braided in their hair the map to the free Black village that was established. And so rather than writing it down in case they got taken by settlers, they braided it into the hair so that people could find the village. So like really, women have been holding it down for all of society and liberation, from aesthetics with hair to seeds and maps. So when you look up that, I'm sure you'll discover some more about Black women's hair and how magical it is.
Could I ask if you could share the slides with us, and if you're fine with us sharing it with the world? And I also thank you, and any friend of Tiffany is friends of ours, and I'm super thankful for you coming and joining us. But there were so many times when you were sharing that I feel like I need to meditate on some of the words, and your notes would be great. Thank you.
Absolutely, I'll definitely share them.
Yeah, there were a few times tonight when we were talking about all of this, and I had this thought about all like the issues that come up and are bringing different, Tiffany used the word affinity communities a lot, and I love that. But it's that community, it's a lot like a compost pile. And if we get stagnant in our little areas, there can be no air and it can rot and not be healthy. And in cultivating good community that's stirring, it's like truth, it's opening up, it's letting air come in, and that's how healthy culture is made. And there's more life and there's more diversity, and maybe microorganisms that didn't even exist before can be born in that space of that spaciousness, I guess, and then good seeds can grow. And it's a beautiful process, and I'm so grateful that you're a part of it.
I love that.
That we all are. Yeah.
That's such a beautiful analogy.
You know, the term permaculture and you know, trying to sort of integrate these concepts, I was really appreciative that you really were able to cut right to the sort of the heart of what permaculture is attempting to grapple with, and how does that spread, you know, to different communities, and be more inclusive. You know, is that something? What is it? What is the reaction you've heard to that term and to the maybe the culture that's developed around it or whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, I think I hear a lot of different theories around not only permaculture as a practice, but really a way of life. And in a lot of the conversations that I've heard about it, no one is mentioning Indigenous people. And I'm always confused, like, how are people not mentioning Indigenous people? Like, this sounds so Indigenous, you know, and just like in learning about the different principles and in learning about like agroecology and regenerative agriculture and the different systems that can be a part of permaculture, I just felt like there was so much Indigenous resonance. And so I was like, this has to be related to indigeneity. And I didn't see any like explicit connections that I found that were written, and I just felt like that was really missing. So I don't think I'm the first person to say that, but I haven't seen I personally haven't found a lot of conversations about permaculture talking about really that the root of all of this is Indigenous ways of life. So that's my feeling, to just explicitly say it, to be like, I'm sure a lot of other people had said this before me, but just so we know, this is about Indigenous ways of life.
Yeah, to speak to that, it came up in our decolonization conversation earlier, how we have to kind of grieve that as people who are into permaculture, because there's this great injustice that generally it's these white Australian men from the 70s who are given credit for all these ideas. And even though those men sometimes accredited the indigenous cultures that they got it from, they aren't cited with all of their sightings. They're the people who are cited. And our facilitator earlier, Adam, he likened it to a watershed where the permaculture teachers before us were these mostly white men who talked about the white men. And now we have this opportunity of those of us who are coming together now to teach those around us and our children and our communities. This is what it's really about. So whatever's downstream from what we're doing today can be a better representation of where this knowledge came from. So hopefully we're a part of that reality, like now.
Go to the top of the mountain and regenerate the soil with indigenous beans.
Indigenous beans. All right. Yeah.
I can begin to get the sense of what I have been missing growing up in this mainstream Eurocentric culture. I haven't had any ties to the land, and I've not had any ties to anybody. And as I realized, I needed that to be a mentally healthy person. I simply couldn't survive without it. And coming to Sahalee here has been my way of getting back. And I feel the urge inside me to get back to the village, to the traditional village that my people lost so long ago. And it's like, it's still, that desire is hardwired inside of me. I can feel it.
I'd like to say something about the indigenous people and permaculture. I've been involved in permaculture for over 30 years, maybe longer. And when I first learned about permaculture and took my first permaculture education, the indigenous traditions were emphasized by the teachers. And it makes me feel kind of sad that you people now are not, that hasn't filtered down, that lineage hasn't continued, so that there's this conversation now where there is no, you're saying there's no you don't feel a connection to the indigenous people that this was from, because in the first permaculture books by Mollison and Holmgren, they definitely give credit to the indigenous people. And a lot of the references in some of those books are to like Chinese, the farmers of 40 centuries, and other indigenous cultures. So I'm not sure how that got lost, or put aside, but I think originally there was, at least I perceived there to be quite a connection to indigenous people. And there was kind of an irony that the permaculture teachers were going back to indigenous communities and teaching them some of the things that they had lost and reteaching it to them when it had come from them originally. So I just wanted to say that. So, and I think, you know, there should be, and there I hate to use that word, but there should be more connection to that lineage of indigenous people.
Brent, who did you study with is a question from Patricia.
Well, my first course I took Michael Pilarski and Simon Henderson and Larry Santoyo and Rick Valley and some of the real, you know, the early permaculture, the early adopters, you might say. But so they all gave a lot of credit to the indigenous roots of permaculture. So.
I definitely think there were a lot of references, but as Shaylee says, it sort of reproduces itself. And so once you cite the white man who cited indigenous people, and then you just stop citing the whole lineage. And so eventually people don't see those references at all. And rather than it saying permaculture as inspired by indigenous practices, it's like there's a separate thing that is permaculture. There are these indigenous references, but there wasn't that thread that was held throughout. And so I think it is also an issue of the academy and the way the academy likes to keep things white male. And so rather than citing people who are not writing books, who are not reproducing knowledge in the way of the academy, you cite people who produce knowledge in the way of the academy, which eventually loses the history of people who are not having knowledge in this very specific way. Yeah, so sure. I think there's for sure a connection, and I also was hearing a lot about references of Aboriginal people in the 70s, but that sort of has been lost, I think, and I don't know if I ever felt like it was explicitly stated as not being inspired by, but coming really from that place of Aboriginal ways.
I think sometimes go ahead, Brent.
There was a effort to get permaculture accepted kind of as a mainstream science, so that's where the academy thing came from. And also, I was just thinking about community and how indigenous people are losing their land. A lot of the reason they lost their land is because they didn't have title to the land, because they'd lived there for thousands of years, but they didn't have title. So kind of the same kind of thing, you know, on a different scale. But so I just want to say that about, you know.
That's exactly where I was going, Brent, is possession. They wouldn't even say, indigenous people, many of them wouldn't even say that they own the knowledge. It didn't come from them, it came from nature. And right. The problem breaks down is when we have a possession-based culture. It's possession of each other, it's possession of land, it's possession of knowledge. And I think one of the roots, this is David's perspective, is the fact that we have a possession-based culture that took maybe something from Mollison and we just made it ours. Oh, I learned from Mollison and I'm a student of Mollison and, you know, I figured this thing out, rather than like, hey, Mollison looked at the nature and he also learned how to look at nature from these indigenous cultures and saw what they saw, and he also looked. Are you gonna look like Bill Mollison and the indigenous people? Instead of that, we just made things our own. This is my new idea. And we start—
David, I liked how you said it earlier. You said I'm trying to remember how you said it. It was that we learned, permaculture, whatever, learned how to listen to nature, learn how to see nature, but can we start even crediting, we're not even considering crediting the being that the indigenous people were observing. Yeah. That's how you said it.
I'm sorry to interrupt now, but I need to because that's my job. And we have a time check for what's coming up, and I want to respect Teju's time. And I want to respect Galen and Jonavi, who are right there in front of us and ready to play some tunes in a minute. 1 minute. Woo! Yeah. So I want to give a big thanks. And if we can all just take a big, like, refreshing breath and moment of gratitude for being in this space together and being open to sharing ideas and truth and our questions and all that. Because that can be like, it's a courageous space, right? It's a brave space. And I'm so grateful we're all here.
Thank you so much, Teju. And also, we're not in an extreme amount of hurry. So if you want to say anything else, please do.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure we could have these conversations forever. I mean, Shaylee will send around the slides, and feel free to contact me. And I think it's important for us to just have these conversations on a regular basis and not only have special convergence moments to talk about it, but just sort of talk about it on a daily basis. And I think that also makes it more palpable when it's not just like 7 hours of colonialism, but we're talking about the ways it shows up in daily life. And then we could sort of change those little ritual habits and make them more decolonial. So
yeah, totally. Thank you.
Could you put your email in the chat, Teju? I would love to get a hold of you and visit with you some more sometime.
I will.
Thank you.
And just so we all know, on the schedule is her website and contact. And we like to have a love offering option for all of our session leaders. And I believe we have her PayPal information there. If you want to bless her extra, you are totally welcome to do so. Thank you. That's all on the schedule too. And her contact information is also on her website if you don't find it here. Thanks.